Right. I think we'll make a start. Others will join us shortly. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. It is Dr. Bethany Sollereder. Yeah, because, I've been practicing it because I had nightmares of I'm butchering your surname, but anyway, I got it just about right.
Very good.
And she's a postdoctoral fellow at Laudato. That's part of the Research Institute at Campion Hall in the University of Oxford. And Bethany volunteered for this, so we are greatly in her debt when our previous speaker was unable to be with us. And so Bethany will speak, and then following her, we will have Professor Isabella Bunn, who I'm not seeing in the meeting yet. Hopefully she will join us. And yes, I do see Isabella. I apologize, Isabella is here. And so Isabella will offer some initial thoughts following Bethany's presentation, and then we'll have our usual Q&A. So we are in your hands, Bethany. I would encourage you all to observe the normal protocol in terms of please muting yourself. And Bethany, off you go.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to share these thoughts with a group like I know we have here. So I will begin. I'm talking about theology past the tipping point. The world is changing rapidly. Despite the pandemic raging across our world, climate change remains the most pressing issue for human health and well-being. But that the climate is changing is actually not really news in one sense. So any geologist could tell you that the climate has changed many, many times. As you can see from this graph, the Earth is estimated to have spent more time, for example, without polar ice caps than it has done with them. So massive amounts of climate change are part of the natural course of things. So notice that where we are now on the right-hand side is about halfway between the coldest global temperatures in the last 500 million years and the average, or at least the point where we don't have polar ice caps. So we're actually in a relatively cool global period if you look at the whole history of complex life on Earth. Now, the Earth has also spent significant amounts of time almost entirely covered in ice, the so-called snowball Earth, the last of which was just before the period in the previous graph. Now, the snowball Earth has only been escaped by means of tectonic plate activity, building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere until the greenhouse effect melted the global ice cover. So actually the greenhouse effect is precisely why we're able to be here now. Now, both extremely hot periods and extremely cold periods resulted in mass extinction. So scientists estimate that 99% of all species that have ever existed have now gone extinct. Extreme climate change and the extinction that ensues are actually normal phenomena for this third rock from the sun. Now, for the last 11,000 years, however, we've had a relatively stable global temperature, and this period is known as the Holocene. So you can see the temperatures rising out of the last ice age here into the stable temperatures on the right side of the graph. But keep in mind that even the high temperature on this graph is still rather cool when compared against the much longer Earth history. Now, the important thing about this period, about the Holocene, is that it is during this time, during that last 11,000 years, that humans have significantly reshaped the Earth through agriculture and domestication. Now, while behaviorally modern humans have been around for about 50,000 years, it's during the Holocene, taking advantage of these stable temperatures, that our ability to expand our population due to reliable and scalable food sources has really bloomed. So when scientists or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change talk about climate change or moving out of pre-industrial levels, we're talking about moving out of that Holocene sweet spot that has sustained the expansion of the human population. So in this talk, what I'm going to actually explore is what it means theologically if we're past the tipping point, if we're leaving the Holocene behind and facing a new normal of ever rising temperatures. This is not yet a scientific certainty, but Professor Tim Lenton at Exeter University, in a paper published by Nature in 2019, argued, I quote, that the intervention time left to prevent tipping could already have shrunk towards zero, whereas the reaction time to achieve net zero emissions is 30 years at best. And he talks about how this change represents an existential threat to civilization. And he says, we are in a state of planetary emergency. Now, scientists don't normally speak in that kind of language. They don't talk in such acute terms. And in a sense, we could critique him. It is actually animal life, particularly humans and large mammals, including livestock, that are most endangered by a warming climate. Particular plant species, yes, are also at risk, but not plants as a whole. And the majority of mammals are endangered because they depend so heavily on an extremely narrow slice of species for food. So 75% of the global human food supply comes from just 12 crops and 5 livestock species. Our livestock themselves live largely on just a few cereals and soy. And this leaves humans and human livestock extremely vulnerable to a rapidly changing climate, vulnerable to mass starvation or lack of fresh water, both and to use in irrigation for our water-hungry crops. So I'm not sure how much there will really be that is very optimistic in this talk. As opposed to all things bright and beautiful, I tend to focus on all things grim and depressing. But let's begin with a point of light. No matter how badly Earth temperatures rise in the coming centuries, we are not talking about the end of life on Earth, not even close. And this is because the vast majority of life on Earth is not human or even animal. By weight, there's 35 times more bacteria than there is of all animal life combined. Humans and mammals compose just 0.067 gigatons of carbon, according to carbon weight, or 0.25% of life on Earth, again by carbon weight. So as Bill Bryson once noted, bacteria may not build cities or have interesting social lives, but they will be here when the sun explodes. This is their planet, and we are on it only because they allow us to be. And he could have said the same about archaea and protists and plants. Now, we have been trained to think of humans as the pinnacle of creation, the end point of all previous species. Theologically speaking, this is in particular because of 2 doctrines. First, that humans are made in the image of God, and second, because of the Incarnation. That God took on human flesh and dwelt among us gives humans an exalted identity amongst life. Yet increasingly, scholarship is beginning to question how necessarily anthropomorphic those 2 doctrines really are. So anthropomorphism is the idea that only humans matter. Well, anthropocentric is defined as humans having a central place, but it does not specifically entail being the only creatures that matter to God. So I will use anthropomorphism because it's more specific, but you could just substitute in your brain the sort of bad kind of anthropocentrism, like when Immanuel Kant wrote, "As the single being on earth that possesses understanding, man is the titular lord of nature. And supposing that we regard nature as a teleological system, he is born to be its ultimate end." That's the bad kind of anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism. So our question is, do the image of God and the Incarnation indicate theologically that only humans are of value to God's creative purposes? If humans go extinct, for example, is the story of creation over? Well, the work of Ruth Page, Dennis Edwards, Jürgen Moltmann, Holmes Rolston, Elizabeth Johnson, Niels Gregerson, and many others would argue no. Well, most of these authors, Ruth Page might be an exception, would defend that humans have a uniquely important place in world history. They are anthropocentric. They have been emphasizing the importance of animals and the non-human creation to God. And so one example of this is the concept of deep incarnation coined by Niels Gregersen. So deep incarnation is an attempt to expand the boundaries of where we see the importance of the identification of the particular life of Jesus of Nazareth with the wider world. So when Christ became Jesus of Nazareth, we don't see that as only of significance to Jews or to carpenters or to men. I'm sorry, my cat keeps stepping on my PowerPoint. Let me get back there. The importance of animals. Let me begin again. So in becoming human, all humans are represented by Christ. We know that. Not just humans, or not just carpenters, not just men, not just Jews. Humanity as a whole is ennobled by that act of God. But deep incarnation asks, why stop there? The Gospel of John does not say God became human and dwelt among us, but God became sarx, God became flesh. But traditionally, we've only bothered to spell out what it means that God became human, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. What we have not done is fully articulate what it means that God became flesh, that God became mammal, or God became chordate, or God became animal. If you really want to stretch it, God became molecules of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, etc. So deep incarnation allows us to see the unity that the incarnation offers not only to humans regardless of race or gender, but also to all life and even possibly all matter. So what would this mean for extreme climate change? It could mean that even if humans and most animals go extinct, that the providential purposes of God can be remade and redeemed. The implications of salvation offered through the incarnation are not at all limited to the human species. Who is to say that God will not start a new phase of salvation history through the future descendants of the octopus or of the remarkably intelligent slime mold? Now, I don't necessarily think there need to be another incarnation, because with the thinking of deep incarnation, God has already inhabited shared flesh with the cephalopod and the slime mold. So just as God did not need to become incarnate in every race or culture or gender, but came once for all, so I don't think that God needs to become incarnate in every species. Yet in the Hebrew Bible, there are many theophanies where God is revealed to people in a form akin to the incarnation, whether that's to Moses, set in the crag of the rock, or to Abraham as the three strangers, or to Jacob as the adversary at the ford of Jabbok. Now, perhaps in this way, through various theophanies, God could be made present to those future species, just as God has been present in all of Earth's history. So the incarnation does not require us to have an anthropomorphic view of the centrality of humans, even if it is anthropocentric. God's creative interaction with the world could continue in a radically changed world. So what about the image of God? If we looked at the diverse tempting to agree with Hendrikus Berkhoff's wry observation that, quote, by studying how systematic theologies have poured meaning into Genesis 1:26, one could write a piece of Europe's cultural history, end quote. So exegetes seem to have largely taken whatever supposedly essential attribute they liked best about themselves and decided that that is what it means to be in the image of God. Scholarship has gratefully more recently moved away from the search for that singular and essential quality. Rationality, morality, dominion, sensitivity to God, creativity, or whatever else. Instead, scholars have focused on relational or Christological interpretations of the Imago Dei. And these point either to the unique relationship God has chosen to have with humans, or to the idea that Christ is the only one fully made in the image of God, and that the rest of us are made in the image of God insofar as we are conformed to the likeness of Christ. Now, both of these interpretations do not suggest any reason for why the image of God needs to stop at the boundary marker of the human species. Just as God elected to have a particular relationship with humans, so God could call any species. As Joshua Moritz has pointed out, God's election of Israel, for example, was specifically because there was nothing at all special about them amongst the nations. They were not the most powerful, nor the most numerous, nor the most skilled. So there is a sort of arbitrary nature to God's call. They were called because they were loved by God. So too, other species might be called in future because of God's love. And in terms of the Christological interpretation, which is we are in the image of God insofar as we're conformed to Christ, there's again no need to stop at the boundaries of the human species. Insofar as the giant squid is or can be conformed to the likeness of Christ, the giant squid too could be considered to be made in the image of God. So the story of God's creation did not begin with humans, and there is no necessary reason to believe that it will end with humans either. The off-scandalous promiscuity of Jesus's love for everyone in the New Testament opens the door to exploring what the love of God means for those beyond the human community, and how the story of God might play out amongst populations that we have no interactions with, or who are in the far future, long after we are gone, become part of what we reflect on. And in fact, work on what to do with the possibility of extraterrestrial life poses many of these same problems. And I've had the work of people like David Wilkinson in mind as I discuss this. So creation, far from being a static description of something that happened in the prehistoric past, describes God's ongoing work with the world. God is creating every day new possibilities, new relationships, options. So I don't want to necessarily argue for or against some of these speculations, but just open up the question, how essential is the continuation of the human species for the ongoing work of God? Now, I've started with reflections on sort of the worst case scenario in the, I hope, long distant future of dramatic ecological collapse of all animal life. But what about in the short term? If we can be persuaded that the long-term purposes of God cannot be thwarted by our failure, how should we think about the short term? Now, again, I'm taking for granted, for the sake of this paper, that the changes in climate in terms of global warming are past the tipping point, that they're irreversible in the short term, regardless of what political or national action we take at this point. Now, this is not proven, but I think it's worth asking what it will be like if it does happen. What if the polar ice caps melt, the oceans swell, the temperatures rise, and the crops we have relied on for thousands of years no longer produce as we have known them to? What if the dwelling places of all those who live on the ocean shore are inundated by rising waves? What if there is mass migration out of nations that have become too hot for human habitation? And as a result, there's mass starvation due to the failure of those stable crops on which we all rely. That is a grim picture. So let's fill it in with some of the facts and the projections that we actually have. So currently, global ice is melting at a rapidly increasing rate. Glaciers are disappearing. So for example, in the United States Glacier National Park, the 150 some glaciers that earned the park its name have dwindled to only 25, and those that remain have dwindled significantly. So you can see just from these two pictures of the Swift Current Glacier. Ice at the polar caps is even more startling. Normally stoic scientists are now warning that global ice is hemorrhaging. Ice melt from Greenland and the Arctic could increase sea levels by 3 to 7 feet by 2100. And if the West Antarctic shelf melted entirely, which would take longer, seas would actually rise by about 35 feet. The East Arctic ice shelf, which again would take centuries to melt as it holds 4/5 of all ice on Earth. But if it did melt, assuming everything else on Earth had long since melted, the eventual rise would be 216 feet. Most coastal cities would be underwater. London, New York, Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, Baghdad, Beijing, Hong Kong, Singapore, Mumbai, Calcutta, Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, all these would be lost under the waves. And even in less apocalyptic circumstances, the effect of climate change on human economics will be profound. So according to the most recent report of the IPCC, the rise in tropospheric ozone has already reduced yields of wheat, rice, maize, and soybean by between 3 to 16% globally. And we're looking at a change in those same crops by between 3 and 7% for every degree Celsius of increase in global mean temperature. So these are not only key crops for humans, but for the livestock that they're fed. Fisheries are also at risk, with rising sea levels and rising temperatures contributing to problems ranging from introduced species to various diseases to a dramatic lowering of oceanic oxygen levels and rising acidification of the waters. So severe reductions in food production, compounded by the risk of increased inequality of food distribution due to climate-related factors, will mean that malnutrition and starvation will increase. And this is not in the far future. We're seeing these changes already. There are already climate refugees, and we could be looking at significant changes by 2050. And all of this is only if you don't also factor how much human conflict rises with the instability of the predicted increases in fires, flooding, lack of food, and population displacement. So I'm going to put up just a couple of slides that are from that IPCC report that's talking about how different amounts of warming will set out risks of what will happen. And there are a few benefits, so benefits for Arctic fisheries, you can see there at the top. But in these other areas, you can already see how high the risks are getting in these different areas. And here's the other slide. Now, note that the temperature in November 2020 was already 0.97 degrees, so almost a full degree Celsius above the 20th century average. So we're already looking very closely at that first column. We're just about there. So if we're past the tipping point, which means that the move up these columns and beyond is inevitable, it means that the mere restriction of carbon emissions or the natural forms of carbon capture will not stop climate change. If that's true, then there's actually only two possible routes, ultimately speaking. One, we could attempt drastic interventions to try and stop the changes, or two, we could try to adapt to a world whose changes in temperatures will likely not stop at even 3 degrees and will cause widespread extinction. We might be able to slow down the pace of that change, but we would be admitting that the change is out of our control, and our focus would switch towards adapting for both ourselves and other species. Now, either one of these choices has underpinning theological considerations and implications. So if we attempt drastic interventions like releasing aerosols in the high atmosphere to reflect the sun's incoming heat, or fertilizing the oceans to encourage CO2-hungry algae blooms, it presupposes a particularly strong sense of our human species' control over the biosphere. It is undoubtedly the case that humans have changed every ecosystem on Earth, but much of this was done without the knowledge that we could affect the very fabric of these systems. But to try and geo-engineer the Earth through intentional planet-wide interventions would be to take a role in planetary history that is intentionally, self-consciously one of dominion and of control. We could no longer pretend to be simple stewards of creation, nor could we act as if we're simply one part of the community of creation, just trying to live in harmony with everything else. So ever since Lynn White Jr. blamed Christian models of dominion for the environmental crisis in his landmark 1967 paper, theologians have been falling over themselves to emphasize the participatory and non-coercive nature of the human role to the non-human world. So John Zizoulis, T.F. Torrance, John Chrysavis emphasize that the human relationship to nature is one of priesthood, of self-sacrificial service, and mediation of praise rather than one of control or dominion. Richard Bauckham insists that we must think of ourselves as a part of the community of creation, but not its master. So sorry, Immanuel Kant. Anne Primavesi calls stewardship exploitative and unecological, while Claire Palmer condemns it as unbiblical. Now, the exercise of human control over the natural world amongst theologians is not popular. But paradoxically, if we take up the task of stopping the snowballing climate before it becomes an avalanche, or if we take drastic action to alter the course of that avalanche, we have to be honest, they are of the earth are to be protected and preserved. It will only be by the human community asserting an enlightened guardianship over it, end quote. Now, whether the human community is actually capable of sustained enlightened guardianship is quite another question, over which a very large red flag ought to be waved. Now, I can hear some of you saying, but intervening is only to clean up what we have messed up. It's different. And okay, maybe, but arguably you could see it as worse. The first people who started to dig up coal in industrial amounts did not have the faintest clue that they could change the composition of the Earth's atmosphere or the seemingly boundless oceans. But we would be striking out to cause a change at a global level without knowing whether or not it will work, or if it will only make things worse. This would be a sort of global policy of mammals first. Now, if, however, we choose to adapt to the changes, to perhaps mitigate the worst case scenarios of widespread extinction, but largely to avoid these sort of radical steps to ensure our own survival and that of the species we rely on, then we have to have some really frank discussions about suffering, death, and even eventually about human extinction. With these changes will come an immense amount of suffering, and we need to be able to encounter that. If creation is not uniquely about human existence, then perhaps we should be willing to embrace the inevitable decline of our own species. We might take the position of John the Baptist towards Jesus. He must increase and I must decrease. Other life must increase and we must decrease. And this leads us to reflect on the place of extinction, the death of every individual of a species. Now, both death and extinction are normal, the eventual end of every life and of every species. But just as the loss of an individual is the loss of a unique voice in the world, so the loss of a species leaves the world poorer. It's like losing an instrument section from an orchestra. A whole type of music becomes impossible in the symphony of creation. But how far should we resist it? Short of nuclear war, of course, this is not a question that is on our immediate horizon as a species, but it is worth asking, how far should we prioritize mammalian survival, that mere 0.25% of life on Earth over all other life? Or to what extent is that desire malignant? To an extent, it's like the attempts of the transhumanists to cheat death by living forever on silicon, or those who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to have their bodies cryogenically frozen at the point of death in the hope that they can be revived by modern advanced medicine in the future. Meanwhile, some spend thousands of dollars on that, others starve to death today of malaria or the want of pennies. There is an unbalanced approach to death in our culture, but that's another talk for another time. My question is, to what extent would it be similar for us to take radical actions towards stabilizing global climate when, looked at over the course of Earth's history, the climate is not naturally stable? Perhaps we should simply embrace the changing, given that human action has really only hastened a change in climate that would have been inevitable in the long run. Alternatively, we might argue that we are co-creators with God, and creating an artificially stable climate for the benefit of so many creatures is actually part of our calling. Philip Hefner's phrase of created co-creator has been used in the work of Ted Peters and others to suggest that we should not merely steward the natural course of things, but that humans are right to use their creativity and their unprecedented power to create a new state of things that combines human and divine creativity. So you could look for, as an example, at the broad scope of the Bible. God begins by making a garden for people to dwell in. Yet, after expulsion, Cain founds a city. Cities are not part of God's creative remit, but are the work of human hands. Yet, in the final eschatological image in the book of Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem is described as a garden city, a melding of these two types of dwelling place, the creativity of God and of human hands combined. So if the stable temperatures of the Holocene would normally have changed in 1,000 or 10,000 years, they still would have changed. But perhaps way as Christopher Southgate has suggested, our task could perhaps be to eliminate the existence of extinction altogether, both human and non-human, which of course could only be achieved through utter mastery of Earth conditions. Now here is the rub. I don't know, nor can I tell you which is the right way to go. Radical attempts to try to stop climate change may themselves have radical and unintended consequences. Fertilizing the oceans could very well throw off the ocean's ecosystems in the same way that our land fertilizers have become a poison to rivers and lakes, while ultimately depleting the soil itself. High atmosphere aerosols would cool the earth, but they would also block the light that is life-giving to plants, to name just two examples of unintended consequences. Would preventing extinction, in fact, prevent the development of future species, robbing Earth's history of potential richness due to our reluctance to change? And if we're not wise enough to understand all the consequences of our actions, are we really wise enough to attempt these interventions in the first place? But what is clear is that whichever way we choose, whether radical intervention or active adaptation, the consequences will be far-reaching and globally felt. And very few of those who will literally suffer the consequences will have any part in the decision-making process. Now, I've talked through this lecture about a number of themes, from reinterpretations of the image of God and the doctrine of the Incarnation, and how those might reframe a change from the Holocene to a new world system, to two possible roles humans can play: intervention or acceptance, in a climate that seems to be tipping over the edge of change after 10,000 years of stability. So as befits a lecture on a topic where there is so much uncertainty, there are plenty of loose ends in this, plenty of unexplored paths, and plenty of issues left unaddressed. For example, what could possibly get all of humanity to cooperate in the first place? And who makes these decisions? But thankfully, we have Isabella Bunn here, who is going to bring light and order to the tangled mess I've landed us in. So Isabella, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And I just have to disclaim that introduction for the enlightenment that you promised, which will not be delivered. However, when we spoke earlier this week, we did raise this question of responsibility. In other words, what should be done and by whom? And I'd like to offer just a few informal reflections on that question and this notion of how do we act and who should act. And by complete coincidence, literally just before we got onto this call this evening, I was in another conference session with the British Academy's Future of the Corporation program, which is examining the notion of purpose within the private sector and how that can be transformative in solving the problems of people and planet and not contribute to the problems of people and planet. And the speaker that I was just listening to was Al Gore, who, of course, was former vice president of the United States, but in the recent decades, best known for his leadership on climate change questions. So he very helpfully, among his other observations, made the following observation, that, and I quote, "The will to act is itself a renewable resource." So I think we can take on good evidence some inspiration from that particular remark. I was also reflecting on maybe 3 events in my mind when we had this first conversation, Bethany. You know, obviously I have no capacity to comment on science and religion and what it means in the grand scheme of things. But what it did bring to mind as I was thinking about who is supposed to do what was actually a very early action on my part, which was in the spring of 1970 as a high school student. The first Earth Day was declared. And literally millions of people, 20 million Americans, mobilized in cities and stadia and auditoriums all around the country. And I was one of them. And I marched on Washington, which is nearby where I lived. And, you know, to be very honest, I think in those days, you can imagine my age in 1970, it was sort of part street party and part protest, and it was a remarkable event. So that might have been my first serious encounter with this question of who should do what and when about some of these questions related to environmental change. And I also do remember at the time that in my own mind, there was this sort of, someone should do something, but of course it wasn't very specific about exactly who should be doing what. And also from my sort of street level view, I could not have imagined some of the policy changes that might have actually put into tow. And interestingly enough, so I mean, at that point, that was 10% of the American population actually essentially marched in protest to environmental harm. At a very broad coalition, all different walks of life. And that was one of the interesting phenomena looking back, that this brought together this rare political alignment of Republicans and Democrats and rich and poor and urban dwellers and farmers and business and labor. So that is also, I think, an interesting lesson about how to mobilize even today on these questions. But also it was interesting, I had a chance to look up actually what were the concrete results that emerged out of that first Earth Day, 1970. And literally, it led to the creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of all sorts of other environmental laws, including the National Environmental Education Act, the Occupational Safe and Healthy Act, and the Clear Air Act. And afterwards, there was a Clear Water Act and an Endangered Species Act, and a whole raft of other policy measures at the national level in the US, and then also eventually at the state level. So I think it was a remarkable result for my, say, early awareness to have the good sense to march on Washington in 1970. Today, I think already by 1990, it was 200 million people from 141 countries that were mobilized. 2020 marked 50-year anniversary of Earth Day. So it is a fixture on the calendar. It is celebrated around the world, and it is one way of really mobilizing at the very grassroots level the potential for change. The second, if I could put it this way, that maybe the second event I could think about is really what is coming up now, which is the shorthand COP26, which is the Conference of State Parties, 26th gathering taking place in Glasgow on the 1st to the 12th of November. And of course, United Kingdom being a host of this major gathering. Who's going to be there? Well, I mean, I use the term be there. I think it's probably going to have, well, we don't know, but it may wind up being a hybrid event rather than an in-person event. Heads of state, climate experts, campaigners of all sorts, business leaders, civil society, faith-based groups, academic institutions. In terms of the numbers, it looks like it's going to be over 30,000 official delegates in what they call the Blue Zone, with the official contributions to the event, policymakers, world leaders, how to make progress on climate change. And then literally hundreds of thousands, I imagine this is the virtual side, of people in the Green Zone. So citizens, NGOs, debating environmental awareness, but also social equality and the reflections on the proceedings. So COP, shorthand, of course, this one is going to be in Glasgow, but the one that is probably best known is COP21, which in shorthand is called the Paris Climate Conference. So this was a new international agreement applicable to all countries, trying to keep global warming, to Bethany's point, at 1.5 centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade, in keeping with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this landmark event, I think, now covers something like 189 countries, including the European Union, representing something like 97% of world emissions. A footnote here, given my accent, of course, I do have to mention that the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords and has just recently, due to executive action on the part of President Biden, rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. So this is also a milestone to have US leadership fully re-engaged, and the administration and the various agencies, including the ones I just mentioned that were set up after the first Earth Day, are all going to be making this a top priority. So the sense of impact here is really where the great possibility lies. So what they hope is going to happen is that all countries are going to recommit to long-term goals and what they call, we use this word now in policy, I've recognized, ambition, to be much more ambitious in addressing what's being called a global climate emergency. And then also finish what the previous COP25 was unable to conclude, including rules for a carbon market between countries, and also the future implementation of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So not only will all eyes be on climate change, all eyes will be on the United Kingdom in managing that process moving forward, literally at every level. And my own field of engagement is in corporate responsibility. And this is one area which has been incredibly active, which is how the private sector engages, how does finance engage, how do investors engage, and this whole notion of green finance. And it does then become also related to this, to use the cliche there, this build back better moment that we're facing. The idea that as we're reinvesting in infrastructure, as we're looking at social justice questions, that we're rethinking how to curb pandemics and manage some of the scientific challenges of the world going forward, that really this needs to be sort of an anchoring point for us, that build back process should be based on green principles, such as those espoused in the climate change debate. The third event, I'm rewinding now, so I'm going forward to what's going to be happening in a few months, but now I'm rewinding, and I couldn't quite find the date, but I'm thinking that Professor Paul Fittis might remember when this happened, at least 15 years ago, I'm thinking, but it echoes Bethany's presentation to me, which is at Regent's Park College, and I'm not quite sure if it was under the auspices of the Oxford Center for Christianity and Culture, but it may have been. It was a lecture by Sir John Houghton. I don't know, Paul, if you remember being at that event or when it was. I'll try to find the date for it. But it made a real impression on me because it was a combination, much like what Bethany presented today, of science and religion and public policy and global collaboration to solve a problem. And I think the most persuasive thing I can do in explaining why it was such a singular moment in my own understanding about some of these questions and what needs to be done in the context of sustainability is to reflect on a few passages from Sir John's obituary. He passed away last year. Sir John Houghton, CBE, FRS, FLSW, meteorologist, climate change expert, and honorary fellow of Jesus College, has died at the age of 88. So Sir John was professor of atmospheric physics. He was Director General of the Meteorological Office what we call the MET for short, where he developed a particular interest in climate change. In 1988, he became the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He served that until 2002. So the IPCC reports, he was also the lead editor. Those reports are essentially the best scientific research, thinking, analysis data around the world on climate change. That's then sort of reviewed and assessed and put into these IPCC reports. So it's an extraordinary effort. And interestingly, in 2007, on behalf of his work with the panel, Sir John accepted the Nobel Peace Prize that was shared by the IPCC and former US President Al Gore. So it's a nice way of my events coming together. But let me go on and mention this as well in the context of our gathering here. And I'm going to read this paragraph in its entirety. It is also important to mention that he was a man with strong Christian faith who believed science and faith belonged together. In 1998, he founded the John Ray Initiative with other leading scientists with the aim of mobilizing the church on climate change. In 2002, he convened a landmark conference in Oxford that brought together leading scientists, policymakers, and church leaders from Europe and the US to put forward the urgency of climate change. He was also a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion. And then finally, Sir John's contribution both to the College of Community of Oxford and global understanding of the impact of climate change stand as a testament to his formidable intellect, vision, and generosity of spirit. One of the reasons why it's so important relies on the science. And I've had numerous occasions to engage with many people involved in climate change issues, including physicists over the years. And that moment, the fact that I could point to that experience of having met him, having heard him, having looked at his work, all I could say as an international lawyer who knows nothing about physics and never will is I trust the science. I trust the rigor behind the deliberations, and the science is what's driving the policy change, what needs to be done. And that change is controversial and not easy and costly, and yet essential. And you may also remember that the whole notion of the climate science was enormously controversial. There was a whole, it's actually a thing to be a climate denier, to simply say it is not happening, or then possibly, well, maybe it's happening, but it's not because of any kind of human action or intervention. Or if that fails, as it does gradually, as the science got stronger and stronger and the doubts became less acceptable, then I think, including the oil and gas industry, arguing that just to sow doubt would be enough. In other words, rather than denial, you go down the doubt route just to see some sort of misgiving about whether or not we should be actually doing this. And I think, thankfully, through people like Sir John, in his enormous capacity, has gone a long way to changing that debate. It still exists in some places. It existed in our former president, who's recently not been reelected. He called climate change a hoax, simply a hoax. And you will still find among some companies really protecting freedom to drill, freedom to explore, and so forth, and resisting any kind of efforts. But if you read the press recently, you can also see how the current administration in the US is undoing a lot of those policies and really prioritizing the need to protect our environment. So the other thought that I had in having reviewed Bethany's presentation earlier and speaking with her, and of course, Anthony, we've sort of framed this series as a relaunch, rethinking about what had been called for many years the Oxford Center for Christianity and Culture, and of course now the Oxford Center for Religion and Culture. And what strikes me is just how rich this conversation can be about stewardship, about care for creation across the religions. And so what should we do? I think this is one of the things that we can do, one place where we as a center can take responsibility. So going forward, I hope that we do have a chance, ideally, even though it might not be totally carbon neutral, to gather in person and to have a deeper discussion of where the movement on climate change has come so far, perhaps in anticipation of what's happening in Glasgow, perhaps just afterwards as reflections from those results, to renew that commitment across the religious traditions and renew the intellectual capacity to engage science and religion, both in terms of the philosophy and the understanding, but also in terms of responsibility. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So Bethany, are there any immediate responses you want to make back to Isabella before we throw this open to everyone else?
The only response I really want to ask is another question, which is sort of at what, I mean, you've talked about grassroots movements, but you're also involved in policy at these very high levels. Given the speed at which we need to see change, which do you think is the most likely, the most realistic for going forward from here?
I think, Bethany, going back to the science, I think having the scientific targets, and I think there's something very powerful about a target. There's something very powerful about metrics that can be measured. And I think the technology is being enhanced all the time to be able to do that in a more concise manner that is more convincing and persuasive. And that then is tied to actionable areas of activity. And that could include, of course, technological innovation, as well as changes of conduct, as well as policies, as well as incentives and so forth. So I think there has to be leadership at all levels, including at the highest levels of international governance through the United Nations. Of course, climate change is a standalone agenda item, if I can put it that way, but it's also embedded in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are all seen as integral. You really can't talk about relieving poverty if you're also talking about a failure to act on climate change. And you mentioned also, for just as an example of how it really cuts across so many policy issues at the global level, this notion of climate refugees, the fact that climate change and the rising levels of water could actually force people from their land, their islands, their property, not just temporarily, but literally, that there will be no place else to go back to. And what happens to that displacement? And what are some of the humanitarian and security aspects involved with that kind of a phenomenon? So I think it is a multi-stranded approach. I do think that leadership has to come at the highest levels, at the national levels. I think very encouragingly, cities have been amazing about sustainability as it relates to mobility and infrastructure development. The very fact that Paris has attached its name to that very seminal document is an example of that. But I think as far as when I look at the landscape, of course, I love the international policy. And I'm very keen to see the private sector get engaged, both in terms of green finance and in terms of commitments on sustainability on the part of the private sector, and innovation for sustainability, and measuring social impact and environmental impact is something that they must do, seeing the role of companies somewhat differently than it would have been traditionally seen, but then also seeing the incentives from the financial side, knowing that those kinds of that kind of activity, that those returns will also, in the long run, create better value, and also perhaps mitigate risk, and in that case be financially driven, as well as, let's say, morally or socially or policy driven. So I think this idea of using all the drivers we can to advance on this agenda is really what makes sense. And I think and you see it, I mean, also the next generation, look at what Greta Thunberg has managed to achieve, and what that represents. The classic understanding of sustainability is taking care of our current needs without impacting the needs of future generations. So I do think there's also this inbuilt future focus, just the very nature of what we're trying to achieve here. So I also find enormous energy and encouragement of their passion, but also the choices they're going to be making as consumers, as workers, as parents, as citizens. I think that this is a remarkable moment to really move in a very serious manner on all those charts that you presented, and trying to understand not just the science, but then what kind of interventions are going to make the most difference and add a sense of urgency to the whole panoply of responses.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so in terms of questions,